Thank you very much for the introduction, Roberto. So my name is Nico Langendijk. I'm at STOXX, responsible for the sales of Northern Europe. So that's Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands. I'm from Holland, as you maybe hear from my accent. There's no request for proposal or investment strategy passing my desk where there's not one ESG angle, and that's why we're going to discuss in depth about implementing ESG. If I look to my region, Sweden has been always pioneering, leading in this field. So therefore, I'm very pleased that we have two of our Swedish ESG experts here on stage today to have an open discussion about all the challenges which were earlier addressed by Stefan and the ESG regulation panel. So may I kindly invite Kristen Wallander. Kristen is a Senior Sustainability Analyst of Swedbank Robur. Robur is the asset manager, or is the largest asset manager in Sweden, and they are fully integrating ESG in all their assets. So, may I also invite on screen Nadine Villamar. I'm not sure. Oh, there you are. Nadine has been 17 years at AP1.
27.
27 years at AP1, and she has also been one of the founders of the Ethical Council in Sweden, which we will discuss in a moment. And she recently made a very exciting step to actually leave AP1 and join also the Transition Pathway Initiative. So that is also something which we are going to discuss in a minute. This discussion is set up in 4 parts. I think it's probably good for you all to know also a little bit about the history of Sweden about ESG integration. So why are they such pioneers? Then we're going to talk about implementation and the challenges. Then are we going to discuss where are we standing at the moment in Sweden, and of course what's coming up next. So that's the first topic is the history, and I'm not sure if I think all of us we heard about the AP funds, but I'm not sure if everybody understands that there is an AP1, an AP2, an AP3, an AP4, but there is not an AP5. There is an AP6 which focuses on private equity, and an AP7 which focuses on DC. And then there is this Ethical Council which is on top of it. So Nadine, may I kindly ask you to give a little bit background to the audience about the setup?
Well, the setup, I will take it very shortly. There was a pension reform in 2001 in Sweden. Where they restructured the pension system. That's why AP5 disappeared. And there are 4 AP funds, 1, 2, 3, and 4, that have the same mission. There are global investors. They have the restrictions in terms of assets that they are allowed to invest in, and are regulated by the same law. Then, as you say, AP6 is private equity, and AP7 is another part of the system, whereas AP1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 are pay-as-you-go part of the system. Yep. The other one is the AP7 is really the if you don't select a known asset manager for your premium reserve pension, your money ends up with AP7. So that's short about the system. But history-wise, as you say, Sweden, I would say that the Swedish Parliament was very, very early in starting to think of adding something else than just returns in the guidance to the AP funds. But because with this pension reform, the AP funds are regulated by law. When they discussed the law in the preparatory work, there was one sentence saying ethics and environment should be taken into account, but without compromising the overall goal of high return. This was written late in the 90s, and the law came into force on January 1st, 2001. It was not part of the law, but in Sweden, tradition says that the preparatory work are as important as what is in the law. So that was the start for starting to look at what we today call ESG for the AP funds. And that was pretty early. And the first fund that got this kind of guidance from the Swedish Parliament was AP7, because they started their fund a couple of years before the big reform of the pension system. So they were the ones that started to think, what does this mean for a public pension fund? What should a public pension fund in this area? What does this really mean to take ethics and environment into consideration? So they were the one developing the model that we today call norm-based screening, and saying, well, at least we have to have a minimum threshold regarding what we expect from the company that we invest in. Then AP7 decided to go for the exclusion way of doing things, so screening portfolios and excluding companies that are in breach of international conventions, whereas the other, AP1, 2, 3, and 4, decided to, well, also go on that line, but start with engagement instead, and also excluding if engagement didn't result in proper results. And I would say, to be very frank, yes, that was very early, and that affected the Swedish market quite a lot, but that was about exclusion and norm-based screening. I would pretend that that made Sweden not start to integrate or do anything else for many, 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 many years. Doing exclusion and engagement based on norm-based screening was an excuse not to do anything else. We had our model. Why should we do something else? Integration was not really on the agenda. Was not on the agenda at all. I would pretend it was the Swedish way of doing things is like this, and the international community was, I think, quite impressed by what Swedish managers did, both private and public. But I would say that was a problem, and maybe a problem because the model was very successful. But
and was that because I think already in 2010 or maybe even before the Council of Ethics was launched.
2007 we set up the Council of Ethics to engage together to promote change in international or non-Swedish companies. And part of the problem was the success of this engagement. But I have to give credit to the Swedish ministry, or the current government and the four before, because EP funds are regulated by law. Means that they are not allowed to say you have to do this, you have to do that. We are regulated by law. The only way they can influence what the AP funds do is they request a yearly evaluation of the work of the AP funds. That is usually done by McKinsey, but could be other consultants as well. And what they have since, I would say the last 10 years done is to pull in questions about what the AP funds did on ESG. They started to push this about what do you do about integration, what else, what methods have you developed, and so on. And this evaluation then ends up as a written product to the Swedish Parliament and is discussed in the Swedish Parliament. And of course, the boards of the AP funds take impression about what is in this. So if it's a lot about ESG in that publications, of course the boards say, well, hey, maybe we should do more. So I would pretend that's the way how they have pushed the AP funds into integration without changing the law or anything like that. And that's, for example, you might know that there is the AP funds were, I would say, requested by the Ministry of Finance to agree on a way to report on carbon footprint because they found it very difficult to compare the AP funds. So you have to standardize this. So the EP funds set down and put down what the EP funds would report on. And that has become the standard then on the Swedish market in general, and also pushed out in Europe. So that's how it has worked.
There was actually also in Sweden another driver which was in regards to integrating ESG, and that was actually the responsible policy of the Swedish church. Kristin, can I ask you, to how that affects your, product offering to institutional clients?
We started the first fund together with the Church of Sweden in the 1980s, and it was pure exclusions like tobacco, alcohol, weapons, all those things, 5% limit, and nothing else was really done, and norms as well, until like 96 when we launched our first ESG fund, and that was best in class. It wasn't much integration with the PMs. It was just our teams sending out a list. These are companies you can invest in and these you cannot. So it wasn't much on the integration side, but we still included ESG into the investment process, but in a very strict way.
And if you currently look to your product offering, then you have like 3 different categories. So you have the church, the ethical, so that's probably the greenest of all. But then you also have some Ezra or...
Yeah, we have 84 different funds, and they all have different ways of integrating ESG. They have all different possibilities. If you're a fixed income fund or if you're an equity fund, you can't vote for a fixed income fund. But they all have different ways of including ESG, but you can say it's 3 different levels. You have the ESG funds, and you have the ethical funds, and then you have the platform, which excludes tobacco companies and nuclear weapons and other controversial weapons and coal. So those are the 3 different levels.
So actually, even your standard, your platform funds actually have already a minimum layer of ESG integration. So that's actually your standard.
Exactly, and we exclude, but we're also trying to impact companies to be more sustainable as well. And if we don't see a change, if they're reaching international norms and we don't see a change within 2 years of our dialogue, then we'll exclude those companies as well. Yeah. But it's quite difficult to impact them, and especially on the nuclear weapons side. If you contact a company and ask them, can you please stop manufacturing nuclear weapons, it's difficult. But we actually managed with one company. They sold the company to another one, so it's still out there, but that company actually stopped with nuclear weapons. So that's one good thing.
I also heard about some issues in engagement with a tobacco company.
That's quite difficult. It's what they do. So
exactly. I think in the next part I would like to go more on implementation and challenges. I think one of the first steps, Nadine, will be also to set ESG criteria. And how would you, like we have here a big audience, how would you advise them to maybe set some criteria, and is there some way of, standardizing or?
I would say you have to start in the values of your own organization. There is not one size fits all. There are, as for most investors nowadays, there is probably a minimum threshold about what you want to see and what you don't want to invest in. But that's not integration. That's about we don't invest in this kind of businesses or something. Then to set up when you will start with integration, and integration is not exclusion, that's really introducing ESG in your investment decisions. That's much more difficult than exclusion. Then you really have to start with setting up where do you want to create value? Where do you think that you can? Where do you already create value? How is your creating value process? Yep. And how would ESG fit into that? So for AP1, for example, for a number of years when we started integration, the big buzzword, but then was only carbon emissions, and say, we said this is too narrow. We will not focus just on carbon emissions. That's not our investment strategy to reduce carbon emissions in our portfolio. We wanted a more holistic approach. So we ended up, after discussions with our portfolio managers, with the board, and so say, we want to focus on what we call the resource efficiency, and that's responsible use of natural capital, human capital, and financial capital. It goes to three. So then we started to look, well, if this is our focus, what kind of ESG lens do you want to put on our investments? What kind of both risks should we look at, and what kind of opportunities should we look at? But this is still it's a very long process, and it's an ongoing process at AP1 to really, and then you have to find data to do all this, and that's another.
It starts, if I summarize, it starts with the investment belief. So you first have to look into the organization and maybe also do some research with your trustees, but the investment goals are aligned with the investment policy. And if you look then, for example, on all the different AP funds, they probably all have their own.
We do different things.
Beliefs.
We have different boards with different management teams. So we don't do, for example, AP3 has a goal on carbon emissions, and we at AP1 say never ever we would have a goal on carbon emissions, because we think that guides us the wrong way in terms of investment decisions. So we are different. Yeah.
We also discussed this morning the challenge of ESG data. Maybe it's good, Christine, if because you handle with that on a daily basis. So can you elaborate a little bit on that? What are the issues you see?
Yeah, when we started in '96, there weren't any suppliers around to supply ESG data, and now there are loads of them out there, and they all have their pros and cons. You have MSCI and Sustainalytics and OCOM and others. And they all have pros and cons, as I said. It's difficult with data for companies, and it's difficult for companies to understand what they're supposed to report on as well.
But how do, there was a very interesting slide from Dr. Stefan Herter about the correlation between MSCI and Sustainalytics. I saw in one study it was 0.3. I was actually very intrigued to actually that it went down to 0.2. I hope it's not turning negative one day. That would be really worrisome. Yeah. But how would you, handle that?
The problem is that there's not enough data out there from the companies. So both MSCI and Sustainalytics, they fill in the gaps themselves. And that's what they do. That's what they differentiate themselves from each other. They fill in the gaps. And they do it and say, yeah, this is the most material issue. It's 16.3, and they have different weightings to do it. And they get a number at the end. You get 4.3 or 6.7. And the fund managers, they aren't interested in learning that this company has 0.5 or 10. They want to know exactly what the company is doing and how they're doing it and what they can improve. So we have 3 analysts that we have different sectors that we cover, and it's important to understand the companies. And MSCI and Sustainalytics, they use sectors, and in this sector these are the material issues. But you really have to understand the company. If you have a real estate company, for example, that's just about managing properties, or if you have a real estate companies that doing more construction work, then the risks goes up on the construction side, and it's more to do with health and safety. And it's good to have the sector analysis, because we know that the risks for a mining company in health and safety are larger than for an IT consultant. You don't risk your life going to work as an IT consultant in the same way as you do if you're going to a mine. So we look at different things with different sectors, but it's very important to understand the companies. And if you're covering over 10,000 companies like Sustainalytics do, you can't really go into that detail, the fundamental analysis that we want from the companies. And you have to understand where they are. If you have a Swedish forest company, for example, that's just located in Sweden, or if you have a Swedish company going into China when the land use rights and things, the issues become more complicated. Yeah. And you really have to understand the different issues for each company. So that's where the fundamental analysis comes into play, to understand them.
And Nadine, how are you addressing the ESG data issue?
No, well, I would say what is important, and that you probably all here are aware of, but why do we have this bad correlation? I'm not, well, I am not surprised, and I'm not worried about the non-correlation, because it's based on different way of perceiving or analyzing data that fits their way of thinking. And as a buyer of standardized or external data, you need to realize that if you just put this into your investment process, you just buy their views based on their way of looking at the world, which is not necessarily your way of looking at the world. And that is become very, very evident from very early when I spoke with our portfolio managers at AP1, because we didn't have the team like Robert has that with own ESG analysts. I was the only one, so we had to rely on external data. But have discussions about pros and cons, and really what was fitting into the investment process of what we wanted to achieve. And one problem that has already been mentioned here today is that is MSCI and Sustainalytics, that very, very, very much backward looking, but not only backward looking, it's updated once a year.
And after, if they update the analysis in January, February, for example, and the company have their yearly report in March,
May.
April, the data is actually that they provide us is almost 2 years old.
And that's a real problem. So as we use both at AP1, both MSCI and Sustainalytics and GS with data for engagement and so on, we added a year or two ago Arabesque. This is a more quant database, but that is updated on daily basis. You don't get all the details. There are no big reports, but you see if something happens. If they publish a report showing something, you immediately get a change in their rating on ESG and on norm-based. But you need, it's a challenge. Yeah.
There's also a lot of discussion about the word impact of ESG. And that, of course, has also to do then with measurement and reporting. Kristin, do you have any, can you explain how you do it, and have you maybe some suggestions as we as index provider can improve on that?
Yeah, we are trying, but the companies are also trying, and it's difficult for them to provide the data, and they are struggling, and they tell us that. So we have from our customers that we have to report on impact, but we can't get the data from the companies. So yeah, we're stuck between a rock and a...
Yeah. So there have been already quite some terms mentioned, but one of the new terms is SASB. Do you want to maybe explain a little bit here to the audience what that is, and maybe what will change the reporting of companies?
Yeah, hopefully SASB can help on the material issues for a company. If you report on every issue that's out there, this is not going to drive the best financial result for the companies. It's more important that they report on the material issues, and SASB is helping with that. And they also launched what KPIs the companies can report on. So hopefully it will be more streamlined, and we can get more information from the companies.
Yeah.
But I have one worry, especially when you talk about the impact and what is has so far been developed. It's much about cherry picking, showing all the good you do. You have products helping to resolve SDG number 1, 2, 3, or 4, but not the holistic approach. Maybe you have, take a Tesla that is getting full points on one thing, but then on the other hand, don't necessarily treat their own employees correctly. You have the problem in the supply chain for batteries that every producer of electric vehicles. And how could you pretend, when you assess impact, I would like to see a net impact in some way. It's very difficult to calculate, but most external providers helping to assess portfolios right now are just looking at revenue streams from products and services related to SDGs and completely forgetting how it's produced and so on. So It's and companies tend also to do this cherry picking, showing how they contribute positively. But we all in our businesses contribute both positively and negatively. There is no such company yet where we have 100% positive, and so it's a tricky one. We don't have the solution, but we need to continue this discussion to make things move forward.
And also with the impact investing, and it's more reported on what you do to private customers. You're forgetting about the business-to-business companies. And if they are helping a company to reduce the CO2 emissions, who can actually calculate that? Do you divide it 50-50, or how do you split that?
Yeah, no, it's a lot of questions still. Your job is not only about analyzing data, because that's what people might think at the moment. Kristen, you're actually flying later this afternoon to Denmark. Can you explain to us what you're doing tomorrow there?
Yeah, I've got my Wellington boots and my rain jacket on tomorrow because apparently it's going to rain in Copenhagen. I'm meeting with 2 companies and in Kalundborg, just west of Copenhagen, and seeing the manufacturing sites, and they have a symbiosis with other companies. So one company's waste is a product in another company, and one company the steam is too hot, so another company can use that steam. So it's going to be very interesting to see and learn more about the ESG work that they do as well.
Yeah. And can you also tell a little bit about the engagement, so how you work together with a company, like what you want to see and how you want to improve them?
Yeah, engagement with companies is just not about getting data. It's we meet with a sustainability manager and get information from them, but we also meet with the CFO and the CEO and IR departments and say that these are important issues for us. But then to the sustainability people, we can also provide our own analysis and saying that these are the things that we want you to improve on. And we want to see that within the next 1 to 2 years. And it could be anything from more products and services to help the SDGs, or to decrease the water usage, for example.
Yeah. I see the time is running quickly. I want to go quickly to Nadine, because you actually made an exciting step outside of the 27 years AP funds to the Transition Pathway Initiative.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about this initiative here to the audience?
Yes, the Transition Pathway Initiative was created in January, or launched in January 2017, and it was really the response to the question for 2 pension boards, the Church of England Pensions Board and the Environmental Agency Pensions Board, asking their investment organization after the Paris Agreement to invest in line with the 2-degree word. And say, well, hey, we would like to, but how do we make that assessment to our portfolios? That was because there is plenty of data out there, but that kind of data was not out there. So this was created, started with these 2 pension funds, but adding a number of other asset owners, among them EP funds. That's when I came became part of the steering group of the TPI. And what TPI really does is 2 things. They analyze, with the help of the London School of Economics, the Grantham Institute, which has the climate change expertise, and with data provided by FTSE, but only public data, assess 2 things, and it's what we call management quality and carbon performance. Management quality is really about processes, commitments, responsibility, and so that are in place in the companies, and companies are rated if they report on carbon emission 1, 2, 3, and if they have set strategic targets or short-term targets and so on. So that's one part of the analysis, which is maybe possible to do for anyone, but convenient that somebody else does for you. And the other one is much more difficult to do, if not impossible if you are not a climate expert, is to assess if the targets, if any, set by the companies are aligned with the 2-degree pathway. So if you say that we will reduce our emission by X, Y, Z, is that, as an investor, we want to know if that's aligned with a 2-degree pathway or 1.5 or 5-degree pathway. And this is what the TPI provides. For the moment, we have analyzed 14 different sectors, roughly 300 companies in these sectors. And you would be surprised to know that management quality, you can perform, we have a scale from 0 to 4. You can be a 4, getting everything right in the management quality scale, but you are not aligned with the 2-degree pathway. So it does not mean even though you can tick all the boxes on management quality, you don't necessarily drive your business in the way that we as investors would like to see. And the other way around, there are companies that do perform quite well on carbon performance, but not disclose anything on the other side. So it's... yeah.
I think we can have a full session on that topic.
I'll be back.
I see that we run out of time, so I would like to check if there's any questions from the audience for our Scandinavian experts.
No, for the moment, we have not done the portfolio analysis. We are aiming at doing a portfolio analysis. But I would say from the universe that we have listed equities that we have looked in so far, very, very few are on the 2-degree pathway. So I would say would not look very good if you do the assessment. And there is an ambition because the data for the TPI is free of use. You just can Google Transition Pathway Initiative, you find all the data, and that's the idea behind it. But then to create a portfolio analysis on this is needed to be developed. But no, unfortunately, so far no figure. But we know that most companies are not really on a 2-degree pathway.
Roberto, are you collecting the questions on the app? Or is there any? Otherwise, I would like to give the word to a very exciting next panel, which is actually also very much related to this one, and that is on the ESG derivatives. So that is about instruments of trading liquid indices, or make the switch from the old benchmark to an ESGX, so that's only exclusions benchmark. And Robur has been also very much involved in the design of those benchmarks, but your colleague Magnus Lindner will explain more about it.